Welcome to Josie to Lagos, an African podcast about Africa from Africa. Why? Because we need this kind of content. We need to take ownership of our own stories, of our own current affairs, and we need to make meaning of what is happening in our own region for ourselves. Today, we're looking at a very interesting country and we're looking at two very interesting events. An African giant passed away on the 12th of November. His legacy could arguably be considered to be more important than that of Kwame Nkrumah. The reason I say that is because his impact on his nation was more long-lasting in terms of lived legacy and was more significant in terms of the health of the state. There is a legacy that Nkrumah has on the continent of Africa. He's recognized widely as one of the founders of the African Union. He repeatedly tried to realize a United States of Africa in his lifetime. And he argued that Africa could not succeed without this continental unity. However, his legacy was not as cemented in his home country, and his reputation is not as solid in his home nation. This other man died with his legacy intact. The two men whose lives contradict each other and whose lives path the challenges faced by that country are Kwame Nkrumah and Flight Lieutenant Jerry Rawlings. Today we're going to be looking at their lives, asking questions that arise from studying these two men and also looking at the upcoming elections in Ghana and what lessons we can learn for Ghana from their lives, but also what lessons we can learn for Africa from their lives. So let's start off by looking at some key facts about Ghana in particular. Ghana is located in West Africa on what I like to call the forehead of Africa. If you think about it, you got the horn of Africa, the one side, which is the back of the head, and then the front of the head, the forehead, is West Africa. So Ghana is neighbored by Burkina Faso to the north, Togo to the east, the Ivory Coast or Cote d'Ivoire to the west, and it then has this territory that just touches the Atlantic Ocean. The currency in Ghana is the Ghanaian cedi, and to put it in perspective, it's currently trading at 1:2.6 with the South African rand, and it's trading at 1:5.85 with the US dollar. So when you compare it, it's more valuable than the rand, and it trades, if $1 is worth 5.85 cedis. So that's actually a very strong currency when you think about the African environment. Its ranking, Ghana's ranking on the World Economic Forum Global Competitiveness Index is 111 out of the 141 countries that they track. So it performs higher than Nigeria, but it performs lower than South Africa, Botswana, Namibia, Kenya, and Rwanda. An interesting fact about the Global Competitiveness Index is that 31 of the bottom 50 countries on the index are African. So 62% of the bottom 50 countries that are tracked on this index are African. And 8 out of 10 of the bottom 10 are actually African. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done by Africa in terms of improving its global competitiveness. And clearly Ghana is not ranking very high on that particular index. In terms of gross domestic product, it is the second largest economy in West Africa after Nigeria, and the 11th in sub-Saharan Africa, using obviously some older rankings. These are from 2016. Obviously 2020 makes it very difficult to measure everything. The population in Ghana is 29 million people, making it the 49th most populated country out of the 193 UN member states. The population of Ghana is between 29 and 30 million people. It's the 49th most populated country out of the 193 UN member states. Its population is relatively young, with approximately 57% of the population under the age of 25. It's divided into 16 regions, which are further divided into 250 districts, but there are 16 prominent regions. A key geographical feature of Ghana is Lake Volta, and Lake Volta is the world's largest artificial lake, which was made after the completion of the Akosombo Dam in 1965. And the Akosombo Dam is the one that holds back the waters of the White Volta River and the Black Volta River. And these are prominent rivers in that particular area of the world, or of Africa rather. So this episode is about two men, and it's about the upcoming elections in Ghana and what to expect and what we can learn from these two men. So let's start off by looking at the first man. The first man, one of the most famous African names, which is the founding father of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah. If you talk to most Africans, they know that Kwame Nkrumah, the great Pan-African, but his legacy is more complicated in Ghana. His legacy is a little bit more nuanced than that, and it's one which allows us to begin to think not only about Ghana, but about Africa. Not only about, legacy, but also what do African leaders need in order to become good leaders. So let's look at his life. Kwame Nkrumah was born on the 21st of September in 1909, long time ago by now. He was born in a western village in Ghana. He went to this famous school, which is called Achimota, and several people went to this school in Ghana. It has a very illustrious history. He became a teacher after he was at that school for a while, and then later on he became a headmaster. He had bigger ambitions than being a headmaster, so he moved to America to pursue his further studies. In fact, he spent 10 years in the United States of America, and they did have a large impact on his worldview and his politics. So when he gets to America, he completed a Bachelor of Arts degree in economics and sociology from Lincoln University. He then went on to do a Bachelor of Theology degree from the same university, and he was actually the top student in the course. In 1943, he did a Master of Arts degree in philosophy and a Master of Science in Education from the University of Pennsylvania, which is an Ivy League in America. He was heavily influenced whilst he was there by the teachings of Marcus Garvey. He was involved in a lot of these debates around who is more relevant academically or more relevant to the African American story between Marcus Garvey and W.E.B. Du Bois. And he found the arguments made by Marcus Garvey to be more compelling. He believed in this vision of a United States of Africa. And in fact, while he was in America, he took a bunch of steps which really grew him as a student and which grew him as a leader. While he was in America, he organized a group of expatriate African students in Pennsylvania, and this organization then became the African Students Association of America and Canada. In fact, while he was doing all of this work, they then organized a Pan-African conference, which was held in New York in 1944. And this conference urged the United States at the end of the Second World War to help ensure that Africa became developed and free. So he was very, very, very involved in this kind of extracurricular activity. And this is when he really started to become a political actor and a political player. So in 1945, he then moves to the United Kingdom. And part of what drives this move is because there are two large Ghanaian communities in the international space. There's a large Ghanaian community in America, and there's a large Ghanaian community in the United Kingdom. And the United Kingdom relationship stems from the colonial nature of the relationship between the United Kingdom and obviously Ghana. So also in the United Kingdom at that time, there were a lot of African diaspora students who were learning in the United Kingdom and who were trying to figure out just how they would achieve independence and how they would be able to be free. So the name of the game at that time in the elite circles was also the United Kingdom. You had to be in the United Kingdom to be involved at a very high level. So Nkrumah decided he's going to go to the United Kingdom. And if you look at his academic endeavors, you can actually tell that he wasn't really there to complete a degree. He was really there to make sure that he was involved in all of the Pan-African activities. And there was an upcoming Pan-African conference that he wanted to be a part of. So when he gets to the United Kingdom, 1945, he enrolled at the London School of Economics as a PhD candidate in anthropology. He withdrew after one term. The next year, he enrolled at University College with the intent to write a philosophy dissertation on knowledge and logical positivism. But then he didn't do much at that university. He then enrolled later on at Gray's Inn, but he did not even complete that particular program, and he had enrolled at Gray's Inn to study law. So you can almost tell that his 2 years in the United Kingdom were not as much about his academic endeavors, but they were about something else. And that something else is his Pan-African activities. While he was in the UK, he did two things distinctly. Number one, he took part in a lot of socialist activities with socialist movements that were in the United Kingdom. And then he was one of the principal organizers and in fact had the role of co-treasurer of the 5th Pan-African Congress, which was held in Manchester. And it was held in Manchester from the 15th to the 19th of October in 1945. This was a critical Congress, and I'm going to go through some of the resolutions of that Congress for you just to see what was happening in the UK at the time and where African thinkers were. So the resolutions of that particular Congress: number one, the Congress elaborated a strategy for supplanting colonialism with African socialism. Number two, they agreed at that particular Congress, the 5th Pan-African Congress in Manchester, to pursue a federal United States of Africa. And this federal United States of Africa would have interlocking regional organizations governing through separate states of limited sovereignty. They also planned to pursue a new African culture, which was without tribalism, which was democratic within a socialist or a communist system, and which would synthesize traditional aspects with modern thinking, and for this to be achieved by non-violent means if possible. Among the attendees of this particular 5th conference, this Pan-African Congress, was W.E.B. Du Bois. He also came to make some contributions, and I've already alluded to the fact that, Kwame was not very persuaded by his arguments. Along with Du Bois and illustrious American participants, there were actually some very interesting African leaders who took part. Hastings Banda of Nyasaland, which eventually became Malawi, was present at that particular conference. Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya was present at that particular conference, and Obafemi Awolowo of Nigeria was also present at that particular conference. So you can see that Kwame Nkrumah was heavily involved in trying to chart the path to independence for African states from his, period of time where he was studying abroad. And this actually formed his worldview. It formed a lot of his beliefs and convictions, and it guided how he would navigate his political career. So in 1947, other developments were occurring in Ghana, which would have an impact on Nkrumah's life, or if you will, they intersected with his life and his life course up until that point. 5 elderly professionals in Ghana founded the party that many believed was going to be the party that would bring independence to Ghana. And I'm talking here about the United Gold Coast Convention, the UGCC. The UGCC was led by Joseph Boaka Dankwa, who was a well-respected academic and lawyer. So these 5 elderly gentlemen who were professionals in Ghana, they recruited Kwame Nkrumah to professionally run the party as Secretary General, with the task of organizing the party structures and spreading the message to the masses of Ghana, and really, they gave him the goal to galvanize the public. His reputation in America and the UK had preceded him. And really, this 5 founding fathers of the UGCC, they were at work and they realized they could not run a party professionally and they needed someone else. And I'm sure if they could be asked, and some of them cannot be because they've passed on, they may say that they regret that particular decision. The decision wherein they hired Kwame Nkrumah to be, the Secretary General of the movement, because they gave him an immense amount of power. His youthfulness, his position in life, and his worldview, it was not in direct cohesion with their particular worldviews. And this led to a lot of confrontations. So Nkrumah believed in approaching the youth, approaching the masses, convincing them, organizing strikes, using labor, using farmers to actually agitate the state. And some of the older leaders of the UGCC were not necessarily in alignment with him. So in 2 years from 1947, Nkrumah split with the UGCC and he made a new party. And that party was called the Convention People's Party. Now, this party really took Nkrumah's identity and ideology and used it to galvanize the people. He challenged the UGCC. And at that time, the UGCC had a slogan which said, "Independence in the shortest time possible." And in Kwame Nkrumah's party, the CCP, said, "Independence now." The older politicians were more conservative in their approach than Kwame. And, this actually slowed down their messaging. And they were not very familiar with the ins and outs of community organizing, while Nkrumah had been doing it all through his life at university, at a variety of universities. And this really made the CCP the most critical and most supported entity within the political framework in pre-independence Ghana, which was then obviously called the Gold Coast. So in 1949 to 1950, a series of events happened which really catapulted Kwame Nkrumah further. The British convened a selected commission of middle-class Africans. And the aim of that meeting was to draft a new constitution that would give Ghana more self-government. And they included all of the original, leaders of the UGCC, and they excluded Nkrumah, who had the masses supporting him. And by the way, they used to call the original founders of the UGCC the Big Six. In fact, they still call them that in Ghanaian political history. These are the 6 founding fathers, if you will, of the nation state. And several of them have had lasting historical impact. They went on to occupy critical roles within the Ghanaian political environment. And one of them actually became the father of a president. So after this commission was convened, Nkrumah saw, even before the commission report, that its recommendations would fall short of full dominion status or full independence. He then decided to fight back and began to organize what he called a positive action campaign. In that campaign, Nkrumah was demanding a constituent assembly to write the constitution. He rejected this constitutional drafting exercise, and he would oftentimes attack Dankuwa, the leader of the UGCC, for, writing an illegitimate constitution. He wanted that this should be written in a constituent assembly. And the governor of the Gold Coast at the time, Charles Arden Clark, would not commit. So Nkrumah started working with the unions, and early in January, a strike was called on the 8th of January 1950. This strike quickly led to violence, and Nkrumah and other leaders of the CPP were arrested just a few weeks later on the 22nd of January. Nkrumah was sentenced to a total of 3 years in prison, and he was incarcerated with common criminals in Accra's Fort James prison. So while in prison, Nkrumah actually was being considered as being out. There was an election that was coming up in 1951. But he then looked at the electoral rules, and the nature of his prison sentence actually was quite interesting. So he was sentenced to 3 years in prison, but it was 3 different sentences of 1 year each. Now, the electoral rules at the time stipulated that you could not run if you were sentenced to more than 1 year in prison. You could not contest for elections. But it didn't make any proviso for somebody in Nkrumah's situation who's sentenced to 3 different sentences, which are running consecutively. So he then recognized that the technicality would allow him to contest for elections. And then he then sent word to the streets that he would be contesting. A lot of the leaders of the CPP were actually contesting for elections while under arrest. And Nkrumah was actually managing the party while he was in prison. The folklore goes that he was actually running the party from prison, and he was delivering instructions to the outside world via toilet paper. So that's actually an interesting thing. Kwame was always trying to work the system and figure things out. So in 1951, there was an election. Kwame was 41 at that time, and they won by a landslide. The CPP, as I said before, had connected with the people. He Nkrumah had actually been able to put a message across for the people, and he had the organizing expertise. And these senior leaders of the UGCC, they did not know much about how to run a ground level campaign. And this may be provoking thoughts about other African leaders. Right now, you may be thinking of Bobby Wine of Uganda. You may even be thinking of Julius Malema of the EFF. But Nkrumah had won the elections in 1951, and then the governor of the Gold Coast then had to think, what am I going to do? So Kwame was actually released on the 12th of February 1951. It took 1 full year before he actually became the prime minister. He was first given a ministerial position in the cabinet. So let's examine Nkrumah's administrative legacy. He was very good at politics, but he was bad at administration. He immediately faced challenges from corrupt officials in his organization. His drive, his socialist program relied heavily on using external companies to build key infrastructure and to actually roll out his vision for Ghana. But if you already started thinking that's going to lead to tender fraud or some form of corruption, you're absolutely right. He also faced challenges from tribal leaders who tried to undercut his authority and to strengthen their hand in the new state that would be formed. And as a chess strategy, he then chose to use legislation which would neutralize his opponents. But I'm going a little bit ahead of myself. In 1952, he became the prime minister of the Gold Coast. And for 5 years, there was a negotiation between the United Kingdom and Kwame Nkrumah and his administration around how independence would be realized. The British had this vision that it would take 10 years to achieve independence for Ghana, and Nkrumah actually insisted on 5 years. So the deal then was reached that it would be a 5-year transition to democracy, and then Ghana then became the first independent African state in 1957, and Nkrumah then became the prime minister of Ghana. So he had this vision when he then became the leader of Ghana. And this vision was that, Ghana would be the springboard to liberate all of these African countries which were still facing colonialism. In fact, he said that the independence of Ghana would be meaningless if other African states would not become independent as well. And he was committed to this vision. So to deal with his challenges from the tribal leaders, to deal with challenges from his political rivals, and to deal with challenges that existed from, British diaspora that were living in Ghana and were still trying to push the colonial agenda, what Nkrumah did was he resorted to legislation that can be considered to be repressive, if you will. So the legislation that he resorted to using were 3 legislation: the Deportation Act of 1957, the Preventative Detention Act of 1958, and a constitutional amendment which came later. So the Deportation Act empowered the heads of state in Ghana to expel persons whose presence in the country was deemed not in the interest of the public good. Nkrumah basically used this legislation to remove British citizens who he thought were subversive and counter-revolutionary, if you will, to the socialist goals of Ghana. The Preventative Detention Act It's actually one that was more heavy-handed to the Ghanaian people. Nkrumah was convinced there had been an assassination plot against him in 1957, and his response was to have the first Ghanaian parliament pass the Preventative Detention Act. And this act allowed for incarceration for up to 5 years without charge or trial, with only the president allowed to release prisoners early. And the idea was, if there are people who are going to pose a threat to the democratic state, those people must be arrested preemptively. And then he used this to arrest a lot of the leaders of the UGCC and several other people who challenged him, be it media, be it judges, and the numbers of people who were incarcerated under the Preventative Detention Act ballooned to well over 2,000 by the end of Nkrumah's term of office. In 1964, Nkrumah made a constitutional amendment that made Ghana a one-party state, with Nkrumah as the president for life of both the nation and its party. So if you look at the legislative decisions that Nkrumah made, he was actually making a lot of decisions which would prevent the risk that he was facing from society. He also passed an act which prevented political parties being formed on the basis of tribe, and this was in 1957 as well. So he basically removed this idea of tribal-based parties. He found a hack to remove British citizens, and he found what he thought was an effective hack to remove his political opponents and put them in prison. But these kind of approaches were not the approaches that were appreciated by the middle class, by the media of Ghana, and they started to create some political risks to his longevity as a leader in Ghana. But if you also see this whole one-party state thing, it's quite dictatorial, and he shared that view with people like Mugabe, and he was really trying to consolidate power in Ghana so that he could move on with his Pan-African project. In 1966, Nkrumah was removed as a leader. On the 21st of February, he traveled to Vietnam, and he was actually going there to be part of a peace brokering, delegation. Within 3 days, on the 24th of February, he was removed as president in a coup. He was deposed by the National Liberation Council. Nkrumah lived the rest of his life in Guinea, and while he was in Guinea, he was actually named honorary co-president. And the reason why is because he was very involved in getting Guinea to be an independent state. And in fact, he financed Guinea at the expense of Ghana. At some point, he gave Guinea 10 million US dollars, and it caused an uproar while he was president in Ghana, because people were of the view that there wasn't enough money to be funding all of these liberation movements. He died 6 years later in 1972, and at the time of his death, Ghana was in bad economic and democratic shape. But we're going to talk about that just now. By 1966, Kwame Nkrumah was very unpopular in Ghana. He was viewed as an oppressive leader. He was viewed as somebody who needed to go. And the military was very, very unhappy with him. He was actually speaking to them about sending them to go and join the liberation fight in Rhodesia to liberate what would then become Zimbabwe. So they were not really interested in doing that, and they did not have the same appetite for Nkrumah's vision for Africa. So many people were of the view that he was wasting Ghanaian money for this Pan-African vision, and in fact he was in a lot of confrontations with some of the leaders of the newly liberated African states, especially the French leaders, because he had the view that those particular leaders were part of what is known as Franc-Afrique, where France runs its interest in Africa through French-friendly leaders. So he had confrontations with them. And basically, the army thought, it's time for this guy to go, and they removed him. Before we talk about John Jerry Rawlings, the other key figure in Ghanaian history, it's important to close the loop on the Nkrumah legacy from an administration perspective. He promoted national industrial and energy projects. He had a desire for Ghana to be an industrialized nation. At the time when he became a leader of Ghana, it was very big in agriculture and mineral mining, but was not an industrial giant. You may know that Ghana is the world's second largest cocoa producer, and cocoa is used to make, or cocoa, it's used to make chocolate and a variety of other things, cocoa butter being another one of them. He wanted Ghana to be a very industrial nation, but his pursuit of that industrialization was very messy. And as a result of that, a lot of factories ended up being these white elephants which are not utilized. And part of it is because of that corruption we discussed earlier, where ministers in his cabinet were seeking tenders so that those particular factories could be built. And there was a lot of wastage because things that were being approved as projects were not necessarily feasible for Ghana at that particular time. But one of the stronger achievements is that he developed a strong national education system. And this is arguably his greatest and longest lasting success internally. Externally, he is of course credited with promoting a Pan-Africanist culture. And if you recall, the Organization of African Unity was founded in 1960, and Nkrumah played a critical role in the founding of the Organization of African Unity, which had this clear and singular focus of one, liberating African states, but inculcating a Pan-African ethos across the continent. And we've discussed the Organization of African Unity and its present health in another episode. So if you are curious to listen to that episode is available. But now let's look at John Jerry Rawlings. We're going to talk about John Jerry Rawlings, and he enters the Ghanaian story at a national level in 1979. So Nkrumah is removed in 1966, and John Jerry Rawlings enters the scene in 1979. What happens in that 13 years in between Rawlings and Nkrumah? I'm going to tell you. After the fall of Nkrumah, one would have expected that Ghana would enter a period of stability, because this is obviously what the army was trying to project to the people and the world. But the next 13 years were very messy for Ghana. The military took over, but they were actually worse than Nkrumah. There were a variety of corruption scandals. There was still the same level of inefficiency, and there were still power struggles. The period between 1966 and 1979, these messy years, saw two military councils sandwiching a transition to democratic rule, but that transition was not successful. Nkrumah was the first president, but by the time Jerry Rawlings stepped onto the scene, there were 5 national leaders in 13 years. 5! That's not a laughing matter. I mean, if a soccer team gets 5 coaches in 13 years, you know that soccer team is not doing particularly well. Ghana was not looking stable as an African country at all. It was looking like a hot mess in that period. So the first military council that took over after Nkrumah was this council that was called the National Liberation Council. Initially, it was led by Lieutenant General Joseph Nkrumah, and he led that particular military council from 1966 until 1969. But he was forced to resign as chairman of the National Liberation Council because of a bribery scandal which involved a Nigerian businessman. So then after he resigned, another member of the National Liberation Council, Lieutenant General Akwasi Afrifa, took over. In 1969, there was the transition to democratic rule. But before we talk about the transition to democratic rule and what happened thereafter, it's important to know that between 1966 and 1969, political parties had been banned and the military was occupying all of the relevant seats. But in 1969, there was a transition of power from the military to an anti-Nkrumah pro-military leader who was called Kofi Abrefa Busia. Now, Busia himself was an interesting figure because he was an anti-Nkrumah politician, and he had fled Ghana during the Nkrumah period of leadership. Remember, Nkrumah started imposing regulations which basically incarcerated his political opponents. So Busia was one of the political opponents who fled the country. So when the army had taken over and they had finally allowed for political parties to resume, together with some anti-Nkrumah friends of his, he formed what was called the Progress Party. The Progress Party won the parliamentary elections with 104 of the 105 seats that were contested. Busia then became the next prime minister, and he was very supported by the army, and in fact, many considered him to be a pro-army candidate. Busia continued with the NLC's anti-Nkrumah stance, and he adopted a liberalized economic system as opposed to the Nkrumah economic system, which is more socialist, which is more about nationalization. While Busia was the leader, there was a mass deportation of 500,000 Nigerian citizens, effectively because many Ghanaians felt that the Nigerian citizens who were high-skilled individuals were stealing their jobs. So this was, in fact, I think, the first recorded instance of Afrophobia in Africa, and it happened in Ghana. So some of the challenges which are happening in Africa in different advanced economies in Africa are not necessarily unique to those countries, but have always happened when there is this crossover of nationalities and this economic integration regionally. Busia lost a lot of his popularity in 1971 because of a 44% devaluation of the national currency, the cedi. So when he devalued the cedi, obviously that meant that a lot of the farmers who were farming crops like cocoa were not going to get the same amount of money which they got. And this met a lot of resistance from the public. And then in 1972, the military, a different military council this time, performed a coup and removed Busia. The first military council was the National Liberation Council, and then the second military council, which removed Busia, was the National Redemption Council. The National Redemption Council then became something that was known as the Supreme Military Council, and it was predominantly led by a leader who was called General Ignatius Acheampong. So Acheampong was in charge of the military council from 1972 until 1978, but he was removed in 1979 by another member of the Supreme Military Council, Lieutenant General Fred Akufo. This is when Jerry Rawlings enters the scene in 1979, when there was this transfer of leadership within the Supreme Military Council to Lieutenant General Fred Akufo, and there was preparation for a national election. But make no mistake, at this particular time, there was massive corruption, there was massive inefficiency, and there was massive public frustration. And this is when John Jerry Rawlings then becomes a national figure in the politics of Ghana. But let's look at his earlier life and how he actually got to the 1979 moment. So let's start talking about John Jerry Rawlings. John Jerry Rawlings was a dominant figure in African politics, and more specifically Ghanaian politics, from 1979 to 2001. Cumulatively, that's 22 years. He was a Ghanaian military official who became a politician. He led the country in one way or another from 1979 to 2001, but officially from 1981 to 2001. So how did he come onto the national scene? Who was he, and what is the contradiction between him and Kwame Nkrumah? So in 1947, Jerry John Rawlings was born on the 22nd of June in Accra to a Scottish father and a Ghanaian mother. So Trevor Noah likes to joke about how the Swiss love chocolates. And this may be the Ghana version of how the Scots also love chocolate. So just a little joke to lighten up the mood. He went to the same school, Achimota, that Kwame Nkrumah went to. And Achimota is this prestigious school, as I've said to before, which is a British model school in Accra. It's actually a school that not only did Nkrumah attend, but at some point even Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe was also present, either as a student or as a teacher. The historic account is not 100% accurate, but he was at Achimota for a period of time. And while he was in Ghana, Robert Mugabe met his first wife, Sally, and she actually became the first lady of Zimbabwe. But that's a story for another day. In 1967, 20 years later, Jerry Rawlings finished his secondary education at Achimota College, and then he decided that he was going to pursue a life as an army official, but more specifically a pilot. It was a childhood dream of his, and he used to speak about how he wanted to be a pilot. While he was still a student, though, this is when the fall of Nkrumah was occurring in 1966, just before he finished high school. And it had a formative effect on his decisions and direction of his life, because then he committed to going into the military. When he joined the military, he enlisted in the Air Force, and he was an excellent airman. So in his first year, or rather in his military career, he earned a very, very prestigious award. But before I talk about the prestigious award, I think it's important to tell you how there was a big typo in the forms and a mistake was made. When he filled in his application, the military switched his surname, which his surname was actually John, and his middle name, which was Rawlings. So he actually was Jerry Rawlings John, but after the military mix-up, he then became Jerry John Rawlings, and he ran with it. And then he is now most famously known as John Jerry Rawlings or Jerry John Rawlings, and most people just abbreviate it to JJ. So there's an interesting side note around the impact of a typo on his name. When he graduated from the military in 1969, he had an award that he won, which was called the Speedbird Trophy, and that was for the best Air Force military cadet, and he was very proud of that award, and he would speak about how he was the winner of that award. For a period of 9 years, he gradually rose through the ranks after he became a cadet, and eventually he reached the rank of flight lieutenant. And this then, allowed him to start linking and connecting with senior military officials. And when he had linked and connected with those senior military officials, he was not impressed at all with what he saw there. He had developed strong relationships with several young military men. And in fact, whilst he was in his military career, at some point he joined what was called the Free Africa Movement. The Free Africa Movement was an underground movement of military officials who wanted to unify Africa through a series of coups. So as it's reported, when he got promoted and he started to see the privileged military classes, to see the privileged of Ghana, his views of the injustices in society and their behavior were not in line with the military and the elites. And then he actually resolved that he was going to side with the people, and he began to think of ways in which to save Ghana in his vision. So 1978, 9 years later, this is when he had made a full transition and began plotting full transition to being a military officer. Early in 1979, he made his first move with a few junior army officials. And that first move on the 15th of May, 1979 was a colossal disaster, but one that set him on track to be the most influential Ghanaian leader to date, even when compared with Nkrumah. And we're going to have that discussion. We're going to make that contrast at a later stage in the episode. But this is what happened on the 15th of May, 1979. 1979 was scheduled for civilian elections. And 5 weeks prior to those elections, Jerry Rawlings and 6 other soldiers attempted a coup against the government of General Fred Akufo, and they failed dismally and they were arrested by the military. Rawlings was imprisoned and he was sentenced to death. But in the trial that was sentencing him to death, he made very powerful statements which connected with the people and made the people consider him to be their champion. In a similar way, actually, to Nkrumah, his prison time made his national reputation a solid one. The fact that he had risked death, that he was facing a life sentence, and that he was speaking in a way that connected not to the aspirations of the middle class of Ghana, not to the aspirations of senior military leadership in Ghana, but to the aspirations of everyday civilians. He then became a mythical figure to them in that time. In fact, some people used to call him Junior Jesus, John Jerry or Jerry John, JJ. So that's where that nickname actually came from. Partly in relation to the initials, but partly in relation to this juxtaposition to the story of Jesus Christ, who was willing to lay down his life for, all of the believers. And people were like, hey, Flight Lieutenant Jerry Rawlings is willing to lay down his life for the people of Ghana. So the buzz, after this failed coup was such that the hopes and aspirations of Ghana were then attached to the person and the figure of John Jerry Rawlings. And this is when he really captivated the nation and took a central stage. It's very difficult to explain quite fully, but when you watch the videos, when you listen to people speaking about him, especially at the time, you really get that he was really viewed at that particular moment as somebody who could resuscitate the hopes and aspirations of the people of Ghana. At that time, Nkrumah was now being viewed in a different way. Nkrumah was now being viewed as somebody who actually was not so wrong, and the military was being viewed as being an entity that had tried to exploit the people and their frustrations, but actually was not acting in their interest and was acting in a way that was very neo-colonial, very pro-Britain, and not necessarily, in a sense, in alignment with the aspirations of the people. And this really allowed for a critical series of events. So just a few weeks later, the shape and trajectory of Ghana changed forever. And JJ had a large part to play in that. On the 4th of June in 1979, while he was awaiting execution, Jerry Rawlings was sprung from custody dramatically by a group of young soldiers, and the claim that they made was that the government was corrupt beyond redemption and that a new leadership was required for Ghana's development. This was the most popular coup in all of those coups which had happened in Ghana. So Rawlings led the coup to oust the Akufo government and the Supreme Military Council. So shortly afterwards, they established what was called the Armed Forces Revolutionary Council, and Rawlings was the chairman of that particular council, and it was primarily comprised of junior army officials as opposed to the other coups which were comprised of senior military officials. So the Armed Forces Revolutionary Council ruled the country for about 112 days before handing over power to a democratic government. A democratic government which was really leaning this time around to Nkrumah vision and ideology. But before they handed over power, there were a series of dramatic actions taken by John Jerry Rawlings which reshaped and restructured Ghana. The actions that Jerry Rawlings took, right, are very dramatic and they're very controversial, and many would not approve of them to this day. his team called these particular actions house cleaning. They said that there was a need to take very, very uncomfortable actions to return Ghana to a path of viable democracy. What are those actions? What did they do that was so dramatic, that requires a cautious storytelling, even as I'm telling you what happened? There were executions, public executions. The Armed Forces Revolutionary Council arranged the execution by firing squad of 8 prominent military officials, including senior military officials, General Kote, Joy Amedume, Roger Feli, and Atuka. And then they also, by public execution, executed 3 former Ghanaian heads of state. Achempong was killed in that public firing. Akufo also was executed, and Akwasi Afrifa was also executed. And the rationale is that these men in the government and in the political space, along with the leaders of the military, had been creating a toxic and undemocratic environment. And this is why they said that it was house cleaning. After the executions, 112 days after the coup, power was handed over to a civilian government. On the 24th of September 1979, the power was passed over to President Hilla Limann. Hilla was the leader of the People's National Party, and this was the party that won the elections that were supposed to happen in 1979, which were delayed because there was a coup and all of that. And this party, the People's National Party, had the support of Nkrumah's followers, and it was viewed really as a successor to the Nkrumah party, the CCP. But that's not where the story ended, because just a few years later, in 1981, power was removed from President Hilla Limann in another coup, and the person who was leading this coup was Flight Lieutenant Jerry Rawlings once again. On the 31st of December 1981, he arrested the president and most of his aides, and he dissolved parliament. And really, it's because there was no change. Hilla Limann had not been able to deal with the demons of corruption, to deal with the inefficiencies in the administration. And looking at the nation, Jerry Rawlings and his military generals who were supporting him were of the view that something had to be done. So this is actually what he said when the 1981 coup happened on New Year's Eve, very dramatically. So you can just imagine 31 December 1982 is about to start, and then there's a coup. And this is what John Jerry Rawlings told his countrymen. He said the following. He said the government had turned hospitals into graveyards and clinics into death transit camps where men, women, and children die daily because of the lack of drugs and basic equipment. So in 1981, that's when John Jerry Rawlings came into power, and this time he didn't allow for a transition of power. He continued with that vision that he had, that they needed to be a cleaning up. And I must tell you, this cleanup is very controversial because it came with a multiplicity of atrocious actions, but they were viewed as being necessary by John Jerry Rawlings, and he pushed through them. So initially, he started off with a Marxist outlook. He was trying to follow the model of Fidel Castro, and he was receiving a lot of support from Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. However, after a few years, he saw that it wasn't working. But in his initial years, the government-run newspapers were actually told not to refer to the 1981 seizure of power as a coup. And while the Libyans had sent in a lot of food and they'd given a lot of support, the efforts of the Libyans were not really, restructuring Ghana. Infant mortality was shooting up, food supplies were dwindling, and in 1983, John Jerry Rawlings took a different approach. He shifted away from the socialist approach. He took Ghana to the World Bank and the IMF, and as a result of that, he had to take a series of actions. And these are generally the kind of actions that you will be forced to take by the IMF. Number one, there was a devaluing once again of the currency, and it made cocoa cheaper, but it affected the farmers adversely. But the country was able to export more cocoa because it was cheaper. So devaluing the currency was the first thing. Number two, there was a firing of lots and lots of civil servants to reduce the size of the public service wage bill. And as a result of those two actions, inflation dropped and the country's economy started to grow. The interesting thing about what J.J. Rawlings did is that other leaders had actually devalued the currency, and every time they had done that, there was a very, very harsh response from the people as well as military officials. But because he had already taken actions to neutralize military opponents and to remove the leaders who had been working with the military to destabilize Ghana, he was actually able to roll out this IMF restructuring agenda. But in the 80s, many in the world viewed him as being an African dictator of the generic variety, because while he was doing all of these structural readjustments, he was still taking the kinds of actions which many viewed as being dictatorial. So there were multiplicity of political prisoners. There was a censored press. He was not a supporter of multi-party democracy, and basically he was pushing for one-man rule. And for the whole period of the 80s, this was the situation. But in the early 90s, what then happened is that there was more of a push for multi-party democracy once again. And you'll see that even in places like Zimbabwe, even Robert Mugabe started to actually recognize that he could not mandate a one-party state effectively. There was a lot of global pressure against a one-party state. So in 1992, they actually did away with the ban on political parties. And 6 months later, Ghana held an election. But Mr. Rawlings was so popular that he won the election without difficulty, and international observers actually said that it was a free and fair election. But one of the things that he did to help himself win the election was that he had increased the salaries of all of the civil servants, and that actually, started creating some more economic problems downstream, and we'll talk about those a little bit later. So he continued with this structural readjustment program that he had been rolling out in line with the IMF recommendations, and it really seemed to be working. Mr. Rawlings was re-elected in 1996, and then he embarked on a road building program. And then he really tried to make sure that the gains were consolidated. And his vice president at the time was Atta Mills. And John Jerry Rawlings was trying to push for Atta Mills to become the next president after his 2 terms ended. But in 2000, his vice president, John Atta Mills, lost the election to John Kufuor, who had run against Mr. Rawlings in 1996. The 2000 campaign was notable, because there was actually a televised debate between the opposing candidates. And at this point, there was now the critical question: will the ruling party allow for a transition of power to the opposition? The answer was yes. John Jerry Rawlings and his counterpart actually accepted the results of the election, and that allowed for Ghana to have a transition of power through a democratic process that really cemented its governance legacy globally and continentally. And many people view Ghana to be a stable democracy. And in fact, there have been transfers of power since that 2000 election. So let's contrast the two figures, because the whole conversation was really about whether or not John Jerry Rawlings had a bigger impact on Ghana and subsequently Africa than Nkrumah had, even though Nkrumah has this reputation of having been the pioneer of the Organization of African Unity and being a Pan-African. So let's do a contrast. On the one level, we have this comparison between a political science student and organizer versus a military-trained leader. And I think it's interesting to think through what that means for governance and what that means for strategy. Nkrumah understood philosophy, he understood sociology, he understood economics, but he did not really have any real understanding of the dynamics of power and force. And as a result of that, he was able to be outmaneuvered by the army. He didn't have strong intelligence. Otherwise, he would have, and when I say intelligence, I mean it in the context of, intel, CIA, FBI, that kind of thing. He didn't have the right level of security intelligence. And as a result, he took this trip to Vietnam at a critical moment in his democracy and was thus removed by foreign powers in cahoots with the military of Ghana. Now, if you contrast that with John Jerry Rawlings, who had spent a lot of time thinking about how and why Nkrumah was removed, but also who understood the military operations and military apparatus. If you look at his period of time in leadership, he was somebody who was able to prevent himself from being, militarily undermined. In fact, Nkrumah had a series of assassination attempts on him while he was alive. But if you look at the John Jerry Rawlings period, there weren't a lot of security risks directed to John Jerry Rawlings. And I think when you make that comparison, it does sometimes show that there's a discrepancy in leadership style, in strategy between the early African leaders who came from either political educations or from military education. So that contrast in and of itself, I think, is just an academic food for thought, because most leaders and young people right now are not necessarily trying to access power through military means. But I do think that the cautionary tale is, in Africa, people do have to pay attention to the dynamics of, having good security intelligence, having good understanding of how the military can undermine the democratic apparatus in and of itself. So that's one comparison. The second comparison, I think, looks at motives. Both of these great Ghanaians professed Pan-Africanism. Both of them had this vision for a greater Pan-Africa. Both of them had this vision for a greater Africa. Both of them used extreme measures to stay in power. Nkrumah used a variety of legislation to keep his opponents in prison. He suppressed the media. He also made sure that, political opponents were not able necessarily to organize effectively. And the reality is, so did Jerry Rawlings. But I think where you can make the distinction is that Jerry Rawlings ultimately was more flexible, and even though both professed to be working in the interest of the people, it looks like John Jerry Rawlings was ultimately the more authentic about that. And I'll tell you why I say this. Jerry Rawlings starts off his leadership regime being very socialist, very aligned to Libya, but then he realizes that it's not working and something needs to be done. And thus, he makes a transition from this socialist agenda to working with the IMF, the World Bank, and embracing, the capitalist model. And it was useful for stabilizing the Ghanaian economy, Ghanaian finances, and also for getting in some much needed reforms at that particular time. That's an indication of a leader who's flexible and willing to make the adjustments to help his people move forward. The second adjustment that I think we see from Jerry Rawlings is that in 1992, he doesn't oppose a move away from a one-party state. And in fact, he embraces multi-party democracy, not in the sham way that Robert Mugabe did, because Mugabe said he was, but he never really had an intention of giving opposition platform to free and fair elections. However, when you look at Jerry Rawlings, when he embraced the one-party state, he embraced it indeed. And what you then see is that there's a contestation of power in 1996, and in 2000 they lose the elections. And Jerry Rawlings shows his final act of flexibility and adaptability and actually being in line with the wishes of the people, in that he supports a peaceful transition of power. And as a result of that, they have been elections, several elections since 1992. And the reality is many people consider Ghana to be a stable democracy. In fact, the 2012 Fragile States Index, I didn't know there was such an index, but it does exist. And the Fragile States Index indicated that Ghana is ranked 67th in the global ranking of fragility of a state. So out of all the 193 states that are recognized as members of the United Nations, Ghana is 67th. And it's the 5th least fragile state in Africa after Mauritius, Seychelles, Botswana, and South Africa. So it comes in as number 5 in terms of the most stable African states. And that is directly attributable to John Jerry Rawlings, to his legacy. And Ghana is going to an election on the 7th of December 2020. They're going to elect the president and members of parliament. It will be the country's 8th successive general election since the resumption of multi-party democracy in 1992. Even more interestingly, no party has ruled for more than 8 years or 2 terms since the return of democracy in Ghana. Incumbent parties have lost on 3 occasions: in 2000, in 2008, in 2016. And that, for me, is a massive contribution to the legacy of Ghana. It's something that Nkrumah was not able to accomplish. It's something that really, when you look at African dynamics, is rare. If you compare with Mugabe, disaster. If you compare with Yoweri Museveni, disaster there. These are 2 dictatorial men who came from, parties that were closely linked to the military, became heads of state, and caused chaos and poverty. People who love Ghana appreciate that John Jerry Rawlings was able to navigate a complex environment to be able to land the plane of democracy. Now, if you're thinking about this from a philosophical perspective, the question then becomes, those who believe in a categorical imperative, those who believe that, wrong is wrong regardless of the motives, will be very, very bothered by the legacy of John Jerry Rawlings, because that legacy includes some very, very strong criticisms of John Jerry Rawlings. Criticisms that he kept political prisoners, he censored the press, he favored one-man rule. At some point, there were killings of Supreme Court justices. At some other point, there were killings of civilians. The criticisms are that those wrongs, in that period of house cleaning, as they used to call it, those wrongs do not justify the means, whatever the means may be. But if you are somebody who is more of a utilitarian, if you ascribe to Jeremy Bentham and the teachings of people who believe that, in instances where you're looking at a moral action, you have to measure the net impact of that action, the greatest good for the greatest number. If you ascribe to that moral school of thought, you will view the actions of Jerry Rawlings as having been necessary actions to liberate Ghana from the control of the military and from systematic inefficiencies which had crept into the democratic design. Now, to comment on this, Singapore is another interesting example. Lee Kuan Yew was very tough on civilians, and for many, he was viewed as a dictator and somebody who was autocratic. But the outcomes of his leadership was that, Singapore was able to stabilize and become a prosperous nation. Other people point to Paul Kagame of Rwanda, and they say, while he is indeed a dictator, I think very few people contest that, even though he's winning these elections, he has a dictatorial element to his style of leadership. They will say that is what Rwanda needs in order to prosper. And many people in Rwanda are actually very happy with the leadership of Paul Kagame because the nation is developing, the nation is moving forward. And a lot of the trauma that was experienced in the Rwandan genocide is still being processed, and the nation needs to heal fully before you can start with this multi-party democratic project. People in those schools of thought will view Jerry Rawlings as having been a great, and in fact a greater Ghanaian than Kwame Nkrumah. He's somebody who was able to die with his legacy intact, depending on how you view that particular legacy. But the people of Ghana themselves celebrated his life, and they are grateful for his contributions. As we conclude the episode, I want to tell you that one of his biggest regrets, John Jerry Rawlings, was that he did not deal with inequality. When he came in, he was very opposed to this very, very elite societal structure where the middle class and the upper class were living very, very comfortable lives in the big cities to the exclusion of everyday Ghanaians. And at the end of his life, unfortunately, there is still a massive inequality problem. When you embrace structural reforms, those that deal with macroeconomics, these are the kind of structural reforms that are pushed forward by the IMF, by the World Bank. You do get a good looking balance sheet in terms of your metrics look solid. And as I mentioned earlier, the Ghanaian CD is very strong. They have a stable democracy, but those macroeconomic benefits don't necessarily translate to civilians. The GDP per capita in Ghana is not very high. I think they're in the bottom, 50 globally in respect to the GDP per capita. And when you consider that, it just shows you that there is a long road ahead. And in fact, when we are looking at the elections that are coming up in just a few days on the 7th of December, some of the issues that will still be lingering in Ghana are the issues around how do you deal with the inequality? How do you deal with some of the long-standing structural issues? Just to give you some ideas, as we go into the election on the 7th of December, this is what you need to know, right? There are 275 seats available in Parliament that are going to be contested for. That's important. There are two major parties that are contesting this particular election. The ruling party is the New Patriotic Party, the NPP, which is led by the incumbent Nana Akufo-Addo. And if that sounds familiar, Akufo-Addo is the surname of the first leader, one of the first leaders in the Big Six, who was actually the founders of the UGCC. So Nana Akufo-Addo is actually the son of one of the Big Six leaders. And they won in the previous election 169 seats in parliament, representing 61.5. The second largest party, and really the only other, it's almost an American system in who gets to benefit in terms of electoral seats. The opposition is the National Democratic Congress, the NDC, which is led by the predecessor to Nana Akufo-Addo, John Mahama. So in the 2012 elections, John Mahama was elected president, lost in 2016, and currently his party, the NDC, occupies 106 seats in parliament, representing 38.5% of the seats. The parliament does have a big problem though, because the gender representation in the parliament is very skewed to men. Men occupy 238 of the 275 seats available, representing 86.5% of the parliament being male, and women only occupy 13.5% of the seats. And that's obviously a big sign that gender inequality persists in the structures of power, because if you don't have women lawmakers, it's unlikely that, all of the laws that women need to be passed in order to achieve equality and equity in society will be passed. So the challenges that Ghana is currently facing going into this election is that it has a very, very bad public finance management right now. It's in debt. The country's public debt rate has tripled between 2006 and 2016. So in 2006, it was 26% of GDP, and now it's 74% of GDP. And when you have that kind of a debt ratio to the GDP, you can be at high risk of default. And this is something that can have an adverse effect on your economy. So that's one of the challenges that Ghana is facing at the moment. There has been a deterioration in the financial management of state-owned enterprises, especially in the energy sector. And another thing that continues to plague the Ghanaian economy is the payroll costs of civil service. They continue to absorb a bulk of the budget revenues. And remember, I said I'd bring up one of the, tricky decisions that were made by Jerry Rawlings, and that was the increasing the salaries of civil servants close to elections. And that's a habit that has continued, and people have used the civil service wage bill as part of a way of, gaining political support. But that does create problems and pressure, and we've seen it in other African countries as well. There's a lot of pre-electoral budgetary overspending, which contributes to the accumulation of public debt. So the public debt situation is a massive, massive challenge facing Ghana moving forward. There's also a massive challenge of how the free education programs that the state is running will be sustained, and many who are in the elite and middle class have actually stopped using public education and started moving towards private education, and that's also something that creates education inequality and needs to be addressed. The source of growth in Ghana has always been biased in favor of extractive and capital-intensive service sectors, which do not have a direct impact on the reduction of poverty. And this is one of the things that even Jerry Rawlings was unhappy with, that he had not been able to deal with the inequality and the poverty in the population. There's still a limited and unreliable supply of energy in Ghana, and this is one of the long-lasting problems which continue to exist. But Ghana has been successful as a country, and it's one of the world's most respected countries. It's still a large cocoa producer, but unfortunately, with the Ivory Coast, they were unable to negotiate for a good increase in the price of cocoa, and this pandemic year has had an adverse impact in cocoa pricing, and as a result, an adverse impact in the fiscus, and as a result, an adverse impact in the amount of revenue the state can generate, because cocoa is one of the largest income generators for Ghana. Ghana has had a lot of growth. It's been one of the fastest growing African economies. While there's still a lot of inequality in Ghana, Ghana has at least been able to reduce extreme poverty, which was the first Millennium Development Goal. And in fact, the UN considers them as the first country in sub-Saharan Africa to have achieved that goal of halving extreme poverty. So while extreme poverty has reduced, you still have high levels of inequality and high levels of poverty. There's a difference between extreme poverty and poverty. So that's what the state of play is in Ghana moving into this particular election. And my hope is that in discussing these two great Ghanaians, in discussing their life stories, their contradicting approaches to governance, that you've come to, one, reflect a little bit better on Africa as a whole, but two, reflect a little bit better on Ghana. I hope I've brought you into Ghana beyond the Kente fabrics, beyond the soccer team, beyond a lot of the, jollof rice debates, and I've taken you into the heart of the political journey of this country and shown you what the tough and continuing conversations are. I really hope you enjoyed this episode and got a lot out of it. Took a bit more time for me to make. It's a bit longer than usual, but I do hope that it is food for your Pan-African soul. Thank you so much for listening. This has been an episode of Josie to Lagos.